They said Duke Corvin Hale had broken 3 men in the territorial council chambers last winter. Not figuratively, not politically. Broken. Ribs, pride, the whole architecture of men who thought rank was armor. He hadn't been tried for it. Nobody filed papers, nobody volunteered testimony. The frontier ran on a different kind of law, the kind written in the space between what powerful men decided and what everyone else survived. If you want to understand what happened when a 19-year-old girl arrived at Hale Fortress in a borrowed dress with her dead father's ledger tucked under her arm, you need to understand that first. Stay with this, because nothing about what follows is what anyone expected. Alara Vane had been sitting in it for 11 hours. She knew because she'd counted the milestone markers through the gap in the canvas. 19 of them since Carthan, each one a little more weathered than the last, each one telling her in the wordless language of frontier infrastructure that she was moving away from anything resembling civilization and towards something that had stopped pretending to be civilized a long time ago. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying in the 3 days after the magistrate came with the ledgers and the seal of the Territorial Debt Commission. 3 days, and then something in her had gone quiet in a way that frightened her more than the crying had. Not numb. Numb would have been a mercy, just still. Like the part of her that registered fear had looked at the full scope of what was coming and made a decision to conserve resources. Her father had owed Corvin Hale 4,000 territorial marks. The magistrate had explained the settlement terms in the flat, procedural voice of a man who'd delivered similar news before and had learned not to inflect it with anything that might invite response. The Duke had proposed a marriage contract. The commission had reviewed it. The commission had approved it. Alara's signature, or her guardian's, but she had no guardian, her mother 3 years dead and her father now 2 weeks in the ground, was the final required element. You understand, the magistrate had said, that you are under no legal compulsion to accept. And then he'd set down the alternative paperwork, which outlined the liquidation of her father's estate, including the house, the remaining livestock, the tools, the seed stores, and the personal effects of anyone residing therein, which at that point meant Alara and the 2 farmhands who'd been with the Vane family for a decade and had nowhere else to go. She'd understood. She'd signed. The wagon hit a rut and her shoulder connected with the wooden slat behind her. She didn't reach up to check if it bruised. The 2 men driving, employees of the Duke, both of them quiet in the deliberate way of people who'd been told specifically not to engage, had offered her water twice and food once, and had otherwise treated her with the careful neutrality of men transporting something valuable and fragile that wasn't their problem to feel anything about. She thought about her father, not the man from the last 2 years, the one hollowed out by bad seasons and worse investments and something darker underneath that she'd never fully named, the earlier version. The man who'd taught her to read commission reports at the kitchen table because he said a woman who couldn't read a contract was a woman who could be stolen from. The irony of that sat in her chest like a stone that hadn't decided whether to sink or surface. The wagon slowed. Alara pulled back this canvas edge and looked out. Hale Fortress rose from the frontier landscape like an argument. Not elegant. Nothing about the structure suggested anyone had cared about elegance. It was built for function and survival, and the specific psychological effect of making everything around it feel small. Dark stone, 2 outer walls, towers at the corners that weren't decorative. The approach road was clear-cut for a 1/4 mile in every direction, which meant anyone coming toward it could be seen long before they arrived. The trees on either side of the road were old growth, massive, and they stopped at a precise line that was not natural. Someone had made a decision about those trees. The gate was open. She didn't know what she'd expected. The gate to be closed, maybe. To have to wait, to be processed, to experience the first humiliation of standing outside while someone decided whether she was worth admitting. The open gate felt almost worse, like the fortress didn't need to be defensive about her, like her arrival was so thoroughly anticipated, so completely managed that the gate had been open for hours. A man came out to meet the wagon before it fully stopped. Not the Duke. A steward, she guessed, middle-aged, precise in his movements, wearing the kind of plain dark clothing that said function over display. "Miss Vane," he said. Not a question. "Yes. I'm Aldrin. I manage the household staff." He helped her down from the wagon with efficient courtesy. "The Duke is handling a matter in the eastern fields. He'll return before dinner. I'll show you to your rooms." She stood on the packed earth of the entrance court and looked up at the fortress. Up close, the stone was even darker, almost black in the overcast light, and the scale of it pressed against something in her that she hadn't known was there. Not fear exactly, more like the body's involuntary recognition of being somewhere that operated by different rules. "My rooms," she repeated. "Yes, the West Wing has been prepared." "Not adjacent to his." Aldrin looked at her with the careful expression of a man recalibrating. "No," he said. "The Duke's quarters are in the North Tower. The West Wing is entirely separate." She nodded, filed that, followed him inside. The interior of Hale Fortress was not what stories described. Stories. The ones that circulated in Carthan and the smaller settlements. The ones she'd been hearing in fragments her whole life and in concentrated doses for the past 3 days, described the Duke's home as stripped of anything human. Cold stone and iron, and the atmosphere of a place where warmth had been deliberately refused. She'd built a mental image without meaning to, the image of a space that announced its owner's contempt for softness. What she found instead was a fortress that had been organized by someone with strong opinions about utility. The entrance hall was large and the ceiling was high, and it was, yes, primarily stone, but there were rugs on the floor, worn, not decorative, and the light came from well-positioned windows, rather than the slitted archer's loops she'd half expected. A long table against one wall held stacked papers and 2 open ledgers. Pegs by the door held working coats, heavy canvas, the kind you wore in fields. A pair of boots near the corner were caked with mud and hadn't been cleaned yet. Someone lived here. Actually lived here, not inhabited it like a symbol. Aldrin led her through a corridor and up a staircase to the West Wing, which turned out to be 3 rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a smaller room that she realized after a moment had been set up as a study. A desk, shelves, a window that looked out over the outer wall toward the tree line. "Is there anything you need immediately?" Aldrin asked. "Keys," she said. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Keys to these rooms." She kept her voice level. "I'd like keys." Aldrin was quiet for a moment in the way of someone consulting an internal policy manual that hadn't anticipated this particular situation. Then he said, "I'll have them brought up within the hour." "Thank you." After he left, she stood in the center of the sitting room and did not allow herself to feel the relief that was trying to surface, because relief was contingent on things remaining as they appeared, and she was not naive enough to trust appearances. She went to the study window and looked out at the tree line and made herself think clearly. She was 19. She was legally contracted into a marriage with a man who had a documented reputation for violence and had, as far as she knew, initiated this arrangement specifically because it was easier than pursuing a debt through the Commission's standard channels. That did not speak to benevolence. It spoke to pragmatism. And pragmatism could cut either direction depending on whose interests it was serving. She had no money. She had the clothes in the single case that was being unloaded from the wagon. She had her father's accounting habits, which meant she could read a ledger with the kind of fluency that was actually useful. And she had the version of herself that had kept the Vane farm functional for the last 2 years while her father was drowning, which meant she was not helpless, regardless of how she'd arrived here. She was also, she reminded herself with the cold clarity that had replaced the crying, not dead. Not yet. The keys arrived before the hour was out. A young woman brought them. A housemaid named Petra, who was maybe 16 and who looked at Alara with an expression that mixed sympathy and curiosity in roughly equal parts. Alara thanked her, tested the lock on each door, pocketed both keys, and began waiting for dinner. She heard him before she saw him. The sound traveled up through the stone, boots on a hard floor, not the careful step of someone navigating a household, but the full stride of a person who had never once in their life been required to move quietly through their own space. Then a voice, low, to someone she couldn't see, clipped in the way of a man finishing a conversation he'd already decided the shape of. Then silence for a while. Then Aldrin, at her door. "The Duke will receive you in the main hall," Aldrin said. "When you're ready." She was wearing the second-best dress she owned, which was still plain by any standard and completely unsuited for impressing anyone. She considered that for approximately 3 seconds, and then decided that the impulse to worry about impressions was something she didn't have the psychological infrastructure to maintain right now, and let it go. The main hall was off the entrance corridor, a room built for gatherings it probably hadn't hosted in years. A long table, chairs, an unlit fireplace along one wall, candles burning in iron holders. Not many, enough to see clearly. Corvin Hale was standing at the table with his back to her. He was taller than she'd expected, which was notable because she'd expected tall. Broader across the shoulders too, though the working coat he was still wearing hadn't changed from the fields, apparently, made the geometry hard to read precisely. Dark hair, shorter than frontier fashion usually ran. When he turned, she saw a face that had been weathered by outdoor work and sharpened by something internal that outdoor work alone didn't explain. A scar ran along his jaw on the left side, old, healed clean. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that she would later understand meant he was exhausted, because they went darker when he was... But she didn't know that yet. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment that was either 3 seconds or 30, and she couldn't have said which. "Ilara Vane," he said finally. His voice was what she'd heard through the stone, low, direct, without the performance of courtesy that most men deployed when they wanted something to sound like something it wasn't. "Duke Hale," she said. He pulled out a chair at the table, which, not the head chair, a side chair, and sat down, and gestured for her to do the same across from him. She sat. Between them, someone had placed 2 cups and a ceramic jug of what turned out to be a dark tea she didn't recognize. "You had a long road," he said. "Yes." "How are the accommodations?" "Adequate." Then, because she'd decided in the West Wing that if this arrangement was going to be survivable, she needed to understand its actual terms rather than its surface presentation. "Better than I expected. The study especially." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening. She wouldn't have called it that. More like recalibration, the same thing she'd seen in Aldrin, but faster. "You read." "My father taught me. He thought it was practical." He was right. Corvian poured tea into his own cup, pushed the jug toward her. He was also an idiot about land contracts, but he was right about that. The bluntness of it landed without the cruelty she would have expected from the same words in another mouth. It wasn't designed to wound, it was just stated as a thing that was true. "Yes," she said. He was. Corvin studied her over the rim of his cup. "You're not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd spend the first hour finding out how to get back to Carthan." "I considered it," she said, "but the alternatives were worse, and I'm not interested in choices that make my situation worse." She met his eyes. "I'd rather understand what I'm actually in." The silence that followed was the first one she felt he was using to think rather than to project. "You're in a legal marriage contract," he said, "which means certain things under frontier law. It also means certain things under the terms I drew up, which are different from what frontier law requires by default." He reached to the side of the table and produced a folded document, pushed it across to her. "Read it." She picked it up and read it. It took her several minutes. She read it twice. The second time she read specific clauses 3 times each. The contract was not what frontier marriage law looked like. Frontier marriage law, under the Territorial Compact, granted a husband management rights over his wife's person, property, and labor. The standard commission contract would have formalized all of that. This contract did not. This contract established her as a resident of Hale Fortress with independent right of movement within the territory, granted her access to the household accounts at her request, and specified that the debt her father had owed was considered settled and not transferable to her as personal obligation. It also contained a clause she read 4 times before she believed she was parsing it correctly, a clause that said the marriage could be dissolved at her initiation after 1 year if she chose, with no financial penalty and full right of departure. She set the document down. "Why?" she said. "Why what?" "Any of it. The standard contract would have given you more." Corvin was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the table between them, and she had the distinct sense that he was doing something he didn't do often, deciding how much truth a situation required. "I've seen what the standard contract produces," he said. "I have no interest in it." "That doesn't answer why." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked up at her. "I needed a wife for reasons that are political and that I'll explain when I have better information on how much you can be trusted with. I could have married someone willing, but willing doesn't mean capable, and I needed capable. Your father's situation made you available. I read the Vane estate accounts for the past 3 years before I approached the commission." She went still. "You read my father's accounts?" "Yes." "You knew what the farm actually was." "I knew that someone had been managing it competently while the person whose name was on the deed was destroying it." His voice didn't change register. "I made an inference." She sat with that for a moment. The thing it did to her internal architecture was complicated. She didn't have a clean emotion available for what it felt like to be accurately seen in a context where she'd been entirely invisible. "I won't be managed," she said. The word came out flatter and harder than she'd intended, which was fine, because she meant it flat and hard. I noticed, Corvin said. You asked for keys before you did anything else. Aldrin told you. He didn't have to tell me anything specific. That you asked is the thing. He stood, taking his cup with him, and moved toward the unlit fireplace. Not restless, just the movement of a man who thought better on his feet. I'm not interested in managing you, Miss Vane. Elara. He paused. Elara, I'm not interested in managing you. I have a territory to run and enemies I can't always see, and I need someone in this house who can think, not someone who's been made afraid to think. He turned back toward her. That's the whole of my reasoning. It's not sentimental and it's not complicated. It's also not complete, she said. The political reasons. A sound that was almost humor, not quite. No, not tonight. When? When I've decided what I'm dealing with. She thought about pushing it. She decided against pushing it, not because she intended to let it go, but because she'd learned in 2 years of managing her father's slow collapse that timing was its own kind of strategy. The study, she said instead. Is it for use or display? Use. I'd like access to the estate accounts. If I'm going to be here, I'd rather be useful than decorative. Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. It was there and gone too fast. Aldrin will provide them. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he confirmed. She stood. Then I'll go to bed. It was a long road. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. The clause about dissolution, he said. In the contract. You read it. She stopped. Didn't turn. Yes. It's real. I know, she said. I read contracts for the same reason my father taught me to, so I know what's actually in them. She left him standing by the cold fireplace. She slept, which surprised her. She'd expected to lie awake mapping threats and exits, cataloging everything she'd observed for vulnerabilities and angles. Instead, she was asleep within 20 minutes of lying down. The kind of sleep that comes not from safety, but from exhaustion, finally releasing something it had been holding for 3 weeks. She dreamed about the farm. Not the bad version, the recent version with the dead fields and her father's silence at the kitchen table. The earlier version, the one where the mornings were cold and the work was real, and she knew exactly what each day required of her. In the dream, she was checking the fence line on the east pasture, and everything was in order, and the light was the particular amber of late afternoon in autumn when the work is nearly done. She woke to gray morning light. For 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then the stone ceiling resolved itself, and the unfamiliar weight of the air, heavier than Carthan air, carrying a different mineral quality, registered, and she knew. She lay still and let herself take inventory. The bed was better than the one she'd had at home. The room temperature was uncomfortable in a tolerable way, cold, but not hostile. No sounds from adjacent rooms. From somewhere below and outside, she could hear what sounded like a smithy. The rhythmic report of metalwork, early, whoever it was, had been at it a while. She got up, washed in the basin, dressed, went to the sitting room window. The fortress's inner yard was already in motion, 2 men crossing with something loaded in a hand barrow. A woman she hadn't seen, middle-aged, purposeful, probably another household staff member, moving from the kitchen building toward the main structure with her arms full. The smithy sounds were coming from a workshop she could see the edge of, low roof line, the anvil noise clear in the cold morning air. And at the far end of the yard, by the outer wall's inner base, Corvin Hale was in the middle of what she could only describe as an argument. The person he was arguing with was mounted, a rider who hadn't dismounted, which meant they'd either just arrived or were planning to leave soon and wanted to maintain the advantage of height. They were well dressed in the frontier style, which meant expensive leather and a coat that cost more than most people's horses. A man she didn't recognize, though the quality of his horse and equipment suggested territorial money. She couldn't hear the words. She could read the shape of the exchange clearly enough anyway. The mounted man was doing what men on horseback did when they wanted to deliver information without treating it as conversation, leaning forward slightly, controlling the pace of speech, using the horse's height as leverage. Corvin was doing none of the compensating body language that people usually did in that dynamic. He was standing at his full height with his arms at his sides, and even from this distance and through a window, she could see that his stillness was not submission. It was the stillness of something that didn't feel the need to move because it was not actually concerned about the horse. The mounted man finished speaking. Corvin said something. Short. She could see it was short by the movement of his jaw. Just a few words. The mounted man stiffened, said something back, louder. She could almost make out the shape of anger, even if not the specific content. Corvin didn't react. Said something else. Same economy of movement, same quality of stillness. The mounted man pulled his horse around and left. Not quietly. The horse's hooves on the packed yard surface carried the force of someone communicating displeasure through the animal as proxy. Corvin watched him go. Then he turned and looked up at the fortress wall. Not at her window specifically, just up, with the expression of a man updating an internal calculation about how his morning was going to run. He turned away, went back into the fortress below. She stepped back from the window. Whatever that had been, she'd just seen the opening move of something. The morning produced Aldrin with the estate accounts, as promised. The accounts were thorough and professionally maintained and in a different hand than she'd expected. Not Corvin's, she'd already seen his signature on the contract and the ledger on the hall table. This was someone else's work. She spent 3 hours with them at the study desk before she found the first anomaly. It wasn't large. A discrepancy in the grain commission records from 9 months ago, small enough that it could have been a rounding error, the kind of thing that was easy to miss in a ledger of this scale. She almost moved past it, then she went back. Then she found the second one. Then the third. They were distributed across 3 different ledger years, always small, always in categories that saw high volume and therefore had the most noise to hide in. Grain commissions, livestock transfers, road maintenance requisitions. Nothing that would trip an auditor's eye unless the auditor was looking at the pattern rather than the individual entries. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let herself understand what she was looking at. Someone had been stealing from Hale Fortress for at least 3 years. Not grandly, carefully. The kind of careful that said the person doing it was patient and smart and operating from the inside. She was deciding how to handle this when she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside the study, and then a knock that wasn't Aldrin's knock. Aldrin knocked with a particular restraint that she'd already cataloged. This knock was different, present. She didn't close the ledger. "Come in," she said. Corvin opened the door and stood in the doorframe. He was in working clothes again, coat still on, and he'd clearly been outside. He looked at her at the desk, at the open ledger spread in front of her, at the sheet of paper beside her where she'd been noting the dates and amounts of the discrepancies. He looked at all of that, and his eyes went still. "You found something," he said. "I found several things," she said. "How long has Aldrin been your steward?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, and in those 3 seconds she watched something pass through Corvin Hale's face that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled recalibration she'd observed twice, not the flat economy of a man who'd decided how much to reveal. Something older than that. Something that landed in the vicinity of what it looked like when a person discovered that the ground they'd been standing on was not the ground they thought it was. 6 years, he said. His voice was the same. Only the eyes weren't. "Then it's probably not Aldrin," she said. "The pattern goes back 3 years, and the method is too patient for someone who knows they're leaving. This is someone who believes they have time." She paused. "But it's someone with access to the accounts," which is a short list. He came into the study and stood on the other side of the desk and looked down at the ledgers without touching them. She watched him read what she'd marked, watched him track it. "You found this in 3 hours," he said. "I had good reason to look carefully. Most people who read these accounts for me have been looking for what's here, not what shouldn't be." "I read the whole shape," she said, "not just the numbers." He looked up from the ledgers at her. His eyes were the dark gray now, the exhausted gray, and she understood in that moment that whatever the mounted man in the yard had come to say this morning was connected to this, that she was holding in front of him 2 pieces of a problem that were in fact one problem, and that problem was larger than missing grain commissions. "Who was the man on the horse this morning?" she said. Corvin's jaw tightened, fractionally, but she was already learning to read fractional. "His name is Garrett Voss," Corvin said. "He holds the Eastern Land Commission and approximately half the debt instruments on 5 frontier settlements. And he came here to tell you something. He came here to tell me that certain arrangements he'd proposed 6 months ago and I declined were going to be arranged another way." Corvin's voice was steady. He was informative. "What arrangements?" He looked at her for a long moment. The study was quiet. Somewhere below the smithy had stopped. "He wanted a stake in the Hale Eastern timber contracts," Corvin said. in exchange for what he described as protection from commission interference in my land titles. He paused. Which would only be a threat if someone had given him information about my land titles that isn't in the public record. She looked down at the ledgers, at her neat list of dates and amounts. 3 years. Someone patient. Someone inside. Someone's been feeding him information, she said. Not a question. That appears to be the case. His voice was even, and she understood it was even the way hers had been even in the magistrate's office. Not because nothing was happening underneath, but because the underneath was something he'd decided not to perform. And now that I've found the ledger discrepancies, she said slowly, thinking through the shape of it, whoever's been doing both things is going to find out that I'm here, and that I can read accounts, and that I spent my first morning— Yes, Corvin said. The single word landed in the room with a weight that was not casual. She thought about the contract clause. 1 year, and she could leave with no obligation. She thought about the open gate yesterday, and the keys and the study that had been set up for her secrétaire, and the contract that was not the standard contract. And she thought about how clearly she could now see that she'd walked into something that was already in motion and had been in motion for longer than she'd existed in this house. And that whoever was feeding Garrett Voss information and pulling money from the Hale accounts had not expected her to be here, had not expected her to be her. How much danger am I in? She said. Corvin looked at her with that same quality of stillness from the yard. The stillness that was not unconcern, but its opposite. The stillness of someone whose attention was fully, completely present. I don't know yet, he said, but I think the answer changed this morning. Outside in the corridor she heard footsteps, fast ones, not Aldrin's measured pace. Someone running. Corvin turned toward the door. The footsteps stopped. A knock. Hard. Urgent. What? Corvin said. The door opened. Not Aldrin. A younger man she hadn't seen before, one of the outdoor staff from the look of him, and his face was carrying the particular white quality of someone who had just seen something they hadn't expected to see. Sir, he said, the east gate. He stopped, looked at Alara, then back at Corvin, with the expression of someone uncertain who should be in the room for what came next. The Voss men didn't leave the territory. They're camped at the East Road Junction. There are 12 of them. Another pause. And they have commission papers. The silence in the study was absolute. Alara looked at Corvin. Corvin looked at the ledgers on the desk. Commission papers for what? He said, and his voice was the flattest she'd heard it. The young man's jaw worked once before the answer came out. Seizure of contracted property, he said. They have a debt transfer instrument, signed this morning. He looked at Alara, and the look was not ambiguous. It's in her name, sir. Transferred from the original Vane Commission file. They're saying— He stopped. Say it, Corvin said. They're saying the marriage contract isn't valid because the debt it settled wasn't hers to settle. They're saying she came here under false terms. The young man's voice dropped. They're saying she belongs to Voss now, that he bought the debt this morning and she's collateral. The young man was still standing in the doorway. Corvin didn't look at him again. He was looking at the ledgers on the desk, and Alara watched him go somewhere internal that lasted less than 4 seconds. She counted, and then come back out with whatever decision he'd arrived at, already made and already operating. Get Den and Marsh from the stables, Corvin said. Tell them to arm and stay inside the east gate. Don't open it. Yes, sir. Don't run when you leave this room. The young man slowed himself visibly, stepped out, closed the door with the controlled care of someone who understood the instruction extended to the sound of his exit. Alara was still at the desk. She had not moved since the word collateral landed in the room, and she was aware of her own stillness with the same detached precision she'd used to count the milestone markers on the road from Carthen. It was information, the stillness. It was her body telling her that the wrong kind of movement right now would cost something she couldn't afford. Tell me what a debt transfer instrument actually does under Frontier Commission law, she said. Corvin looked at her. I need to understand the ground I'm standing on, she said. He pulled the chair out from the other side of the desk and sat down. And the fact that he sat, that he didn't pace or go to the window or perform the agitation that the situation would have licensed in most men, told her something about him that she filed next to everything else she was filing. A debt transfer instrument reassigns the creditor position, he said. If Voss bought the Vane Commission debt this morning, he's legally the originating creditor. And the marriage contract settled the debt with you as creditor. Yes. So if he's claiming the debt was never legitimately yours to settle, he's claiming the marriage contract is void. Corvin's voice was flat. And if the marriage contract is void, you never legally transferred out of the debt obligation, which means you're still collateral against an outstanding debt. His debt, now. The room was quiet. Outside somewhere, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the fortress yard continuing, someone crossing gravel, a door opening and closing. The world not yet aware that it was supposed to stop. "Is there a legitimate legal argument there?" she said. "There's an argument." He paused. "Whether it's legitimate depends on whether the commission official who certified it this morning had the authority to process a transfer on a settled account. And did they? Frontier Commission officials have significant discretionary authority," he said, "especially in contested debt classifications, which is why they're useful to men like Voss who can afford to cultivate that discretion." She let herself sit with the full shape of it. 12 men at the East Road Junction, commission papers. A legal theory that was probably thin, but didn't need to be strong, only strong enough to create ambiguity while armed men enforced it. Her name on a debt instrument held by a man who'd come to Corvin this morning on a horse with his back straight and his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd already made arrangements he expected to hold. "He planned this before he came here this morning," she said. "The transfer would have taken preparation." "Yes." "He came to tell you, not to negotiate." "Yes." "Why?" Corvin's jaw moved. "Because he wanted me to know the sequence before it happened. Because that's how that kind of man operates. He wants you to have seen it coming. It's part of the mechanism." She understood that. She'd watched her father deal with men who operated the same way, men for whom the cruelty of advance notice was as important as the outcome itself. It said, "I am inevitable." It said, "Your awareness changes nothing." "What happens if his men try to enter?" she said. "They won't get through the East Gate without my authorization." "And if he has commission papers?" "Commission papers require a territorial magistrate present for enforcement. He doesn't have one." A pause. "Yet." The yet sat between them like weather. "How long does it take to get a magistrate out here?" she said. "From Carthan." "Half a day, if one's already been retained." She looked at the ledgers in front of her. 3 years of patient theft. Information fed to Voss about Hale land titles. A debt transfer processed this morning on paperwork that had been ready before Corvin declined his proposal 6 months ago. 12 men who hadn't left the territory. "This isn't about me," she said. Corvin looked at her. "I'm the mechanism," she said, "not the target. If he gets commission papers enforced on a debt instrument with my name on it, the marriage contract is void. If the marriage contract is void..." She stopped. Thought. "What does the marriage contract give you that you didn't have before?" The pause before he answered told her she'd identified something real. "The Vane land," he said. "My father's farm, which borders the eastern timber route." His voice hadn't changed register, but something in it had gone careful. "Which I needed clear title to in order to refuse Voss's original proposal about the timber contracts. Without clean eastern access, the route becomes legally contestable." She sat very still. "So the marriage contract wasn't primarily about a wife?" "No. It was about land access. Originally." Another pause, and this one she couldn't read as easily as the others. "The rest developed differently than I planned." She didn't ask him to explain the rest. She put it in the category of things that required better information before she could usefully process it. "So if the marriage contract is voided," she said, "you lose clean title to the eastern access, Voss contests the timber route, and you're back to the position you were in 6 months ago when he made the original proposal. Except now he has leverage he didn't have then," Corvin said. "Because now he knows someone in this house has been providing him account information. And if he's willing to use a debt instrument with a 19-year-old woman's name on it as his opening move, he's past the point of offering proposals." She absorbed that. Then she stood up. She crossed the room to the window and looked down at the yard and made herself breathe at a rate that was functional rather than panicked, which required deliberate effort, and she gave it that effort without apology, because the alternative was not an option she recognized. "I want to talk to him," she said. She heard the quality of Corvin's silence change behind her. "No," he said. "Not alone. With you present." She turned. "But I want to speak to him directly. Ilara. He's treating me as property that can be transferred and seized. He came here this morning and delivered his terms and rode away and sent a message through a man who couldn't look at me directly when he said what I was being called." Her voice was level. She was making it level. "I am not going to sit in this room while 2 men decide what I am." Corvin looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the dark gray. He'll try to use it, Corvin said. Your presence. He'll use it to establish that you're accessible, that you can be addressed directly, that the boundary of this house isn't, I know. She held his gaze. I know what he'll try to do with it. I've watched men use access as a proof of concept my entire life. A beat. Let him try. Something moved in Corvin's face. Not quite what she would have called respect, more like the expression of a man updating a calculation he'd thought was close to final. He stood. We go to the wall, he said, not the gate. You speak from height, and I'm standing next to you the whole time. Agreed. If he addresses you directly, you answer through me. No, she said. His jaw tightened. I answer for myself, she said. That's the entire point. Garrett Voss had moved closer by the time they reached the east wall's walkway. Not to the gate. He was tactical enough not to present at the gate directly, which would have forced a confrontation on terms that were too legible. He'd positioned himself and two of his men at the edge of visible range from the wall, far enough to suggest patience, close enough to be heard. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s, she thought, with the carefully maintained appearance of a man for whom appearance was professional infrastructure. Good coat, as she'd seen from the study window. A face constructed around the assumption that rooms arranged themselves to his advantage. He looked up when they appeared on the wall. His eyes went to Corvin first, and then to her, and she watched his recalibration happen with the speed and smoothness of a man who recovered quickly. Duke Hale, Voss said. His voice carried without effort, the trained projection of someone used to addressing spaces. I appreciate you coming out. Say what you came to say, Corvin said. I think you've read the documentation by now. A brief pause. The transfer is legally sound. I had 2 commission officials present, not 1. I anticipated you might contest the process. You anticipated I might contest you showing up at my east gate with 12 men and a debt instrument you processed the same morning you delivered your terms. The timing is what it is. Voss's tone was pleasant. I'd been patient, Corvin. 6 months is patient by any measure. You have no magistrate. The papers aren't enforceable without one. I've sent for one. Voss's eyes moved back to Alara. I should introduce myself to your, a pause built for effect, to Miss Vane, given the circumstances. She's not Miss Vane, Corvin said. Well, Voss let the word settle. That's the question, isn't it? Alara had been watching him with the same quality of attention she'd been applying to ledgers all morning, looking for the pattern underneath the presented surface. He was performing confidence, and the performance was good, but performance required maintenance, and maintenance had weight, and underneath it she could see the specific shape of a man who needed this to work on a schedule he'd already committed to. He was not as certain as he was presenting. Mr. Voss, she said. Voss looked at her with the controlled interest of a man being careful not to look too interested. Whatever the debt instrument says, she said, I'm standing on this wall and I'm standing here of my own choice. You should factor that into your calculation. A beat. The law doesn't much care about standing positions, Miss Vane. No, she said. But it cares about contested seizures, and I'll contest it. She paused. In person, in front of whatever magistrate you've sent for. I'll stand in front of them and I'll tell them exactly what the timeline looks like from where I'm standing, including the fact that you arrived this morning, delivered an ultimatum, and had a debt transfer instrument ready to file inside the hour. Something shifted in Voss's pleasant expression. Not far, just enough. That's a complicated position for a young woman without resources or legal standing, he said. I have legal standing, she said. I'm a party to the instrument you're trying to enforce. That gives me standing. A pause. My father taught me to read contracts. Beside her, she was aware of Corvin's stillness, the non-reactive stillness, the same quality as the yard that morning. Not passive, present. Voss looked at Corvin. This is going to be complicated in ways that don't benefit either of us. Then, uncomplicate it, Corvin said. Pull your men back. Return the transfer document for review. Come back in a week with a commission review officer and no armed retinue. And the timber route is not on the table today. Voss's pleasant expression had thinned to something closer to its actual structure. I've been patient for 6 months, Corvin. I can be patient for another week. But when I come back with a magistrate and no weapons, Corvin said. We'll talk. Voss looked at Alara one more time. The look was not hostile. It was something more considered than hostile, the look of a man categorizing a variable he hadn't properly accounted for and deciding what to do about that. He turned his horse and rode back toward his men. Corvin didn't move until Voss was out of clear earshot. Then he turned to look at her, and she couldn't read what was on his face, only that there was more of it than usual. "You knew he wasn't certain," Corvin said. "He needed it to work today," she said. "If he was willing to wait a week, he wouldn't have sent his men here before his own visit was over." "What told you?" "He filed the transfer the same morning he delivered the ultimatum." She looked out at the road where Voss's men were pulling back toward the junction. "If he had time, he wouldn't have done both at once. That's a rush job. Something about the schedule changed." Corvin was quiet for a moment. "The accounts," he said. She looked at him. "Someone told him what you found this morning," Corvin said. His voice was very quiet. "Someone in this house knew within hours of your arrival that you could read those ledgers, and someone told Voss that his inside access was about to be exposed." The East Road was empty now. The fortress yard below them was ordinary and operational and completely unaware. The smithy had started again somewhere. She turned the shape of it over carefully, the way it connected, the timing of Voss's arrival and his filed papers, and his 12 men who'd never left, the patience of 3 years of small thefts, the information about land titles, the debt instrument with her name on it filed the same morning she'd sat down with the accounts. "They moved faster because I arrived," she said. "Yes." "Which means they know you brought me here for a reason." "Yes." "And they're afraid of what I can do." The word afraid came out with a steadiness that surprised her. Not bravado, just recognition of a thing that was true, and what being true meant about her position in this. Corvin looked at her for a long moment on the wall in the cold morning air. "I need to know who it is," he said, "and I need to know before that magistrate arrives." She looked back at him. "Give me the payroll records," she said, "and the supply requisitions from the last 3 years. Not the main ledgers, the originals. You think you can find it in the paper trail?" "I found the other thing in 3 hours," she said, "and I wasn't looking for it yet." Corvin held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he turned toward the stairs and she followed him, and neither of them spoke, because the kind of trust that was building between them in that moment was not the kind that required words. It was the kind that required action, and the action was already underway, and somewhere between the wall and the study door she understood that she was no longer calculating exits. She was calculating how to win. The payroll records were waiting on the desk when they got back to the study. She didn't ask how. Aldrin must have been moving on some standing instruction. She sat down, opened the first file. Corvin stood at the window with his back to her, watching the East Road. She started reading. 40 minutes in, she found a name. She looked at it for a long moment, looked at the corresponding dates, followed the thread back through 2 other files it held. "Corvin," she said. He turned. She watched his face when she told him the name. Watched it go through something she had no framework for yet. Not surprise, not quite, but a kind of confirmation that landed badly, the way it did when you'd known something was coming and it arrived and turned out to feel nothing like you'd prepared for. Because the name wasn't a stranger's. It was someone he'd trusted with his house for 6 years. The name was Aldrin. Corvin stood at the window with the East Road behind him and the study between them, and he did not move for a long time after she said it. She watched him the way she'd been watching everything since she arrived, cataloging, measuring, reading the gap between what was presented and what was real. What she saw was not the recalibration she'd observed before. This was different. This was a man absorbing a thing that his body had already started processing before his mind had finished deciding what to do with it. 6 years. The number sat in the room without either of them saying it again. She laid it out for him methodically. The payroll irregularities that corresponded with the ledger discrepancies, the supply requisitions signed in Aldrin's hand that didn't match the inventory records she'd cross-referenced, the pattern of information access that narrowed, when you mapped it against who was in which rooms on which days, to a single consistent point. She showed him the paper trail the way her father had taught her to present evidence, not as argument, but as structure, letting the shape of it speak before she did. Corvin looked at the pages she'd spread across the desk. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he was hoping would resolve into a different picture the longer he stared. It didn't resolve differently. "How long have you known?" he said. His voice was even. The evenness cost him something. She could see it cost him something, in the set of his jaw and the controlled stillness of his hands. 40 minutes, she said. "I told you as soon as the thread held." He nodded once, moved away from the window. She watched him cross to the fireplace, cold still, unlit, and put one hand on the mantel and stand there with his back half turned. And she understood this was a man who needed 30 seconds to do something internal that he wasn't willing to perform in front of her. She gave him the 30 seconds. He was in the room this morning, Corvin said, not turning, when the writer came. He was the first person I told about Voss's camp. She had already figured that. She didn't say so. He knew you'd found the accounts before Voss's man came to the door. Corvin's voice was quiet and had a quality of cold underneath it, like stone in winter. Not rage yet, something that precedes rage, the flat recognition of betrayal that hasn't yet decided what shape to take. He sent word while I was on the wall with you. Probably before that, she said, while you were coming up from the yard to find me. Corvin turned. His face was not what she'd expected. She'd expected anger, the frontier version of it, loud and physical and immediately legible. What she saw instead was something stripped back, the face of a man who had spent 6 years reading a room that had been arranged specifically so he would read it wrong, and who was now doing the arithmetic on everything that arrangement had cost him. It was not a face that invited comfort. She didn't offer any. "Where is he now?" Corvin said. "He brought the payroll files up 20 minutes before we came back from the wall," she said. "He was in the corridor outside this room. After that, I don't know." Corvin moved to the door. She stood. "What are you going to do?" He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Find him." And then, the pause that followed was 3 seconds long and had an entire conversation in it about what kind of man he was, and what frontier law looked like, and what the options were when someone in your house had spent 6 years bleeding you and was in active communication with the man currently camped at your east gate with 12 armed men and a magistrate on the way. "I'm going to hear what he says," Corvin said, before anything else. It wasn't mercy. She understood it wasn't mercy. It was something more cold-blooded than that, the understanding that Aldrin was still useful if he could be made to talk. That information about what he'd given Voss and when was worth more than whatever satisfaction came from immediate consequences. She followed him into the corridor. Aldrin was in the kitchen building, not hiding. That was the thing that landed strangely when Corvin pushed the door open, and there he was, sitting at the work table with a cup of tea and the household supply ledger open in front of him, the posture of a man doing ordinary administrative work on an ordinary morning. He looked up when they entered. His face did something very small and very fast when he saw them both, and then it went still again. The kitchen was empty except for him. The cook was elsewhere, the morning prep already done. The fire in the range was burning low. It smelled like bread and wood smoke and the specific silence of a room that had just lost its ordinary ambient noise. Corvin closed the door. "The Vane estate accounts," Corvin said. "You want to tell me about the grain commissions from 3 years back?" Aldrin looked at him. He didn't look at Alara. That itself was a choice. The deliberate non-acknowledgement of someone who had decided she was the most dangerous variable in the room and was attempting to reduce her presence by refusing to register it. "I don't know what you mean," Aldrin said. "Don't." Corvin's voice dropped, not louder. The opposite, quieter in the specific way that made the air in the room change register. "I have 6 years of reasons to have this conversation slowly, and I don't have the time, so don't." Aldrin set down his cup. He looked at Corvin with an expression she could only describe as rehearsed calm, the expression of a man who'd known this conversation was coming for some period of time and had prepared a version of himself to sit in it. "You brought a stranger into this house," Aldrin said. "Into the accounts. Her name is Alara. She lives here. She's been here one day. And she found in 3 hours what you spent 3 years hiding." Corvin moved to the other side of the table and didn't sit. Stood over it, not threateningly, just with the weight of his full presence directed across the surface between them. "How long have you been talking to Voss?" Silence. "Aldrin, I want to know what you're offering," Aldrin said. The flatness of it, the transactional flatness, the immediate pivot to negotiation, did something to the room's atmosphere. Alara felt it, felt the way it recalibrated what kind of conversation this was. Not a man caught and ashamed. A man caught and calculating. Corvin was quiet for a moment. "I'm offering you the chance to speak before I decide what this is. You already know what it is. I want to hear it from you." Aldrin looked at his tea. Something moved across his face that she almost missed. Not regret, not shame, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who had made a series of decisions over a long period that each made sense individually and had arrived at a place that the beginning of the sequence had not made visible. "He came to me 4 years ago," Aldrin said, "before the timber route mattered, when the land disputes were just starting." A pause. "He wasn't asking for much. Commission dates, inspection schedules, nothing you'd have noticed missing. And you took money for it." "I took security." His voice was flat. "You don't notice, Corvin. You've never noticed what it is to be 53 years old in a frontier post with nothing under your name and everything depending on a duke who might marry someone or die in a land dispute and leave his entire household arrangement to whoever inherits the title." He paused. "Voss offered a pension, guaranteed, whatever happened to Hale Fortress." The room was quiet. Corvin said nothing. She'd learned by now that his silences were not empty. They were where he did his most precise thinking, where he let what someone had said land fully before he decided what to do with it. She watched him do that now, watched him take what Aldrin had just said and hold it against the 6 years and the grain commissions and the land title information and the debt instrument filed this morning with her name on it. "He used what you gave him to build a legal case," Corvin said finally. "The land title information, the commission schedule gaps. He built a contestability argument on frontier access rights." "I didn't know what he was building," Aldrin said. "You knew it wasn't nothing." Aldrin didn't answer. "The debt transfer this morning," Corvin said. "He needed to know she was here. He needed to know she'd found the accounts. You sent word this morning." Aldrin's jaw tightened. "Before or after she asked for the keys," Corvin said. The question was specific in a way that wasn't accidental. It was asking whether Aldrin had identified the threat she represented from the moment she arrived, from the moment she made the single request that told anyone paying attention what kind of person she was. Aldrin looked at Alara, for the first time since they'd walked in. "Before," he said. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "He told me," Aldrin said, still looking at her, "that the Duke had made an error, that bringing a woman in who could read accounts was a miscalculation that changed his timeline." A pause. "He told me I needed to help him move quickly, or the protection arrangement wasn't worth anything." "So you moved quickly," she said. "I sent a message. That's all I did." "You sent a message that put 12 armed men at the East Gate by mid-morning," she said, "and a debt instrument with my name on it filed before the ink was dry." Her voice was level. The steadiness of it cost her something, but she was getting practiced at that cost. "That's not all you did. That's what you chose." Aldrin turned back to Corvin. The shift was deliberate. She was a complication he was refusing to fully account for, and the refusal was starting to look less like strategy and more like the instinct of a man who needed to believe his choices hadn't harmed the people they most directly affected. "I want to know what you're offering," Aldrin said again. Corvin straightened. "Here's what's happening," Corvin said. "Voss has a magistrate coming. When that magistrate arrives, he's going to present a debt transfer instrument and argue the marriage contract is void. If the argument holds, it doesn't just affect Alara. It reopens every land title I've consolidated in the last 3 years, because all of them were built on the eastern access route that the Vane contract secured." He paused. "You understand what that means? It means he owns the frontier," Aldrin said quietly. "It means he owns enough of it that the rest follows." Corvin put both hands on the table. "Now, you're going to tell me everything he has, every document, every piece of title information, every commission date and inspection schedule and conversation about my holdings that you gave him over 4 years. You're going to tell me what he thinks he has and what he actually has and where the gaps are." A pause. "And then I'm going to decide what happens next." Aldrin looked at the table between them. "And if I don't? Then I let the magistrate arrive, and I let Voss present his case, and I let the commission decide whether a steward who's been siphoning funds and providing intelligence to an outside party constitutes grounds for criminal fraud charges under the territorial compact." Corvin's voice was quiet. "Which it does, without question." The kitchen was very still. Alara watched Aldrin make the calculation she could see him making, weighing Voss's guaranteed pension against the reality of what frontier fraud charges looked like, weighing 6 years of slow, careful choices against the morning they'd collapsed into, weighing whatever version of loyalty he'd maintained in his own internal accounting against the moment it had finally, fully run out. "He has the title survey from year before last," Aldrin said, "the one with the eastern boundary markers. What else? The commission exemption filings, 3 of them. The legal clerk who processed them has been—" "He has the clerk." Corvin's expression didn't change. "What else?" "He has testimony," Aldrin said, From two of your tenant farmers, prepared testimony about the eastern access road being contested public land rather than private title. A pause. He's been building the case for 8 months, since you turned down the proposal. The weight of 8 months landed in the room. 8 months of preparation. A magistrate on retainer. Prepared testimony. A legal clerk already in hand. The debt transfer instrument with her name on it had been ready long before this morning. It had been ready since Voss started planning, waiting for the moment Corvin gave him something he could use as a trigger. And the trigger had been her arrival, her access to the accounts, the sudden threat to the inside operation that had been feeding Voss his case piece by piece. She'd been here one day and she'd destabilized 4 years of patient groundwork in 3 hours. She understood, for the first time with full clarity, why 12 men were at the east gate. Corvin straightened. He looked at Aldrin with an expression she couldn't fully name. Not hatred, something more precise than hatred. The expression of a man who has finished the math and knows the answer, and is now simply implementing what the answer requires. "Get up," he said. Aldrin got up. "You're going to write it down," Corvin said. "Everything you just told me and everything you haven't told me yet. Every document, every date, every name, all of it on paper in your hand." He moved to the kitchen door and opened it. Petra. The young housemaid materialized from the corridor with the speed of someone who'd been nearby and knew better than to pretend otherwise. "Take Aldrin to the east storeroom," Corvin said. "Lock it from outside. Stay by the door." Petra looked at Aldrin with an expression that carefully contained whatever she was feeling about the instruction. Aldrin looked at Corvin one last time, and the look had something in it she hadn't expected, something that was not calculation and not coldness, something that might have been, in a different life and a different morning, close to regret. He left with Petra without speaking again. Corvin stood in the kitchen doorway and she watched him recalibrate in real time, watched him take the full scope of what Aldrin had laid out and start building the shape of what came next. 8 months of preparation. A magistrate arriving within hours, prepared testimony. A clerk already turned. "He's going to win," she said, "when the magistrate arrives." Corvin turned. "The evidence he has," she said. "If what Aldrin described is accurate, the survey, the testimony, the clerk, a frontier magistrate is going to look at that and look at a marriage contract filed 3 weeks ago and find it easier to rule on the side of the case that's been 8 months in the making." "Probably," Corvin said. "Which means the contract gets voided. Which means the land titles get contested. Which means," she said, "that the only thing standing between Voss and the frontier timber route is the marriage contract being demonstrably valid on its own terms, independent of the debt settlement." Corvin was looking at her with the same quality of attention she'd noticed from the wall. Total. Precise. "If the debt transfer can be challenged," she said, "not just legally but publicly, in front of the magistrate and whoever else Voss brings, if there's a case to be made that the transfer itself was fraudulent rather than just procedurally questionable, you'd need evidence of fraud," Corvin said. "Not irregularity. Actual fraud." "I know." She paused. "Give me the original Vane Commission file. The one the debt was transferred from." He looked at her. "I signed that contract," she said. "I was there. I know what the magistrate said to me, and I know what was in the room, and I know that the original settlement terms were presented to me as final." She held his gaze. "If there's something wrong with the transfer document, something in the language or the certification process, or the timeline that doesn't match what I experienced in that office, I'll find it." "Ilara, I have until the magistrate arrives," she said. "Give me the file." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside somewhere she could hear horses. More than 2, multiple horses, coming from the direction of the eastern road, and both of them heard it at the same time. She watched his face. "That's the magistrate," she said. Not a question. "Too fast," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet. He was already retained, already on his way before Voss came this morning. The full architecture of it assembled itself in the space between them. 8 months of preparation, a magistrate already moving before the final move was made, the 12 men who'd never left, the message Aldrin had sent before she'd even unpacked. The whole thing had been in motion before she arrived. She had accelerated it by existing here, by being competent, by being exactly what Corvin had needed and what Voss had feared. The hoofbeats were getting louder. Corvin looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the controlled recalibration, not the cold strategic stillness. Something rawer than either of those. The expression of a man standing in a kitchen in his own fortress, watching the ground he'd spent 6 years building collapse from beneath him, and looking at the one variable that had arrived yesterday and had not, in the entire course of an impossible morning, once looked for an exit. "The file's in my office," he said. "North corridor, second door." She was already moving. She found the file in 40 seconds. The north corridor was cold, and the second door was unlocked, and Corvin's office was not what most men's offices looked like. No display, no portrait, no object chosen for what it said about its owner. A desk with working surface, 2 chairs, a map table with frontier survey charts pinned flat under glass, shelves of bound commission files organized by year. She found the Vane commission file because it was the newest thing on the shelf and the only file with her name on the tab. She pulled it and opened it at the desk and started reading. The hoofbeats outside were louder now. She heard Corvin's voice somewhere below. Not the words, the register, the tone of a man managing the arrival of something he'd been preparing for since mid-morning. She heard other voices. Multiple. She read faster. The original debt filing was standard commission language. She'd seen it before, in the magistrate's office. And the text matched what she remembered. The settlement terms matched. Her signature matched. She turned to the transfer documentation, the pages Voss would have filed that morning at whatever commission office had processed it. She stopped, read the certification date again. Then she read the authorization signature. The transfer instrument was certified by a commission clerk whose authorization number she recognized from the payroll cross-references she'd done 40 minutes ago in the study. One of the names Aldrin had given them. One of Voss's people. That was expected. That was the irregularity she'd already been told about. What she hadn't been told, what Aldrin apparently hadn't known or hadn't said, was the date on the authorization stamp. The certification was dated 11 days ago. Not this morning, not yesterday. 11 days ago, 2 days before her father's death had been officially recorded with the commission, and 4 days before the magistrate had come to the Vane farm to present the settlement options. She sat very still with the file in her hands and let that date reconfigure everything she thought she understood about the sequence of events. Voss hadn't filed a transfer this morning in response to Corvin turning him down 6 months ago. He hadn't even filed it this morning in response to her arrival. The transfer instrument had been certified before she'd signed anything, before the settlement had been formally offered, before, technically, there was a settled debt to transfer. He hadn't been reacting. He'd built the original settlement offer himself. He'd moved the debt through a compromised clerk before the settlement was presented to her, which meant the settlement had never been valid, which meant the magistrate who'd come to her farm had known or hadn't known he was presenting fraudulent terms, and either answer was catastrophic in different directions. She closed the file. Downstairs she heard a door open, heard Corvin's voice again, closer now, and another voice, unfamiliar, formal, the specific register of a man who spoke as an instrument of the commission rather than as himself. The magistrate was inside. She stood, tucked the file under her arm, walked out of the office and down the north corridor stairs and came into the entrance hall to find Corvin standing with 3 men she didn't know and Garrett Voss. Voss had come inside. He was standing slightly behind the magistrate, a deliberate positioning, the posture of a man who wanted to be visibly deferential to the legal process while being physically present for every word of it. He was in a different coat than the morning. He'd dressed for this. The magistrate was older, heavy-built, with the particular kind of tired that came from decades of frontier commission work and not from this specific morning. He was holding a document folder. He looked at Corvin with the expression of a man who would prefer to be somewhere else but would not be unprofessional about being here. He looked at Alara when she came in. Then he looked at the file under her arm. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mrs. Hale," she said. The room went very quiet. Voss's expression didn't change. Corvin looked at her with something she didn't have time to fully read. "I think that's the question we're here to settle," the magistrate said carefully. "It was a question this morning," she said. "I have information that changes what the question is." They used the main hall. Corvin's 2 men, Den and Marsh from the stables, she'd learned their names during the morning, stood inside the door. Voss had brought 2 of his own into the building, the rest remaining outside. The magistrate sat at the table's head. His name was Crane, she learned, out of the Northern Commission office, 30 years on the frontier bench. Voss sat across from Corvin. She sat beside Corvin, which she'd chosen deliberately, and which Voss had registered with a fractional tightening around his eyes. She put the file on the table. "Before you present the transfer instrument," she said to Crane, "I need you to look at something." Crane looked at Corvin. "She speaks for this household," Corvin said. Voss said, "Magistrate, the woman has been here one day and is being used as—" "Mr. Voss." Crane's voice was not loud. "You'll have your time." He took the file she pushed across to him, opened it, read in silence while the hall held its breath. She watched him get to the certification date, watched his reading pace change, the specific deceleration of a man encountering something that requires him to recalibrate. He looked up at her. "Where did you find this?" "Corvin's commission files. It's the original Vane debt documentation." She kept her voice flat. "The transfer certification date is 11 days ago. The original settlement offer was presented to me 8 days ago. The authorization belongs to a commission clerk whose name appears in connection with Mr. Voss's financial records." Crane looked at the date, looked at it again. "The transfer was certified before the settlement was offered," she said, "which means the settlement terms were presented to me as legitimate options when the legal status of the underlying debt had already been altered without notification. I signed a settlement contract without being told the debt I was settling had already been reassigned." Crane set the file down very carefully. Voss said, "Magistrate, the certification date reflects a preliminary filing, not a preliminary filing on a debt transfer still requires notification to all parties," Crane said. His voice had changed. Not louder, colder. Mrs. Hale, were you notified of any pending transfer on your father's debt before you signed the settlement contract?" "No," she said. "The magistrate who came to my farm presented the settlement as the only existing resolution option. He did not mention any competing instruments on the debt." "Do you know who that magistrate was?" She gave the name. She'd memorized it at the time. Her father's habit again, the habit of recording what people said when they were in a position of authority over you. Crane wrote it down. Voss said, "This is an attempt to muddy a straightforward legal matter with—" "Mr. Voss," Crane said, "I'm going to ask you to stop speaking until I'm done." Voss stopped speaking. His jaw was tight. For the first time since she'd seen him on horseback that morning, the pleasant architecture of his face had something structural happening underneath it. She could see it in the way he held very still, the stillness not of confidence, but of a man recalculating while trying not to show he was recalculating. He hadn't known she had this. She saw it clearly. He'd known she could read accounts, known she'd found the internal discrepancies, moved fast to preempt the damage. But he hadn't known the certification date was in the original file. He'd expected that document to be in commission archive storage, not in Corvin's personal files. Something had gone wrong in the transfer of information between what Aldrin knew was in the house and what actually was. Crane was reading the full document now, both the original settlement and the transfer certification, going back and forth between them. The hall was quiet except for the sound of paper and the fire that someone had finally lit in the hearth. Corvin was sitting beside her with his hands flat on the table. She could feel the quality of his stillness from 6 inches away, the absolute restraint of a man who understood that this moment required her to finish what she'd started and who was not going to disrupt it. "The marriage contract," Crane said finally. "Executed when?" 3 weeks ago, Corvin said. "Filed with the Eastern Commission Office, settlement terms signed and witnessed. Before the transfer certification date." "Before," Corvin said. Crane sat back. What happened in the silence that followed was something Alara had watched happen in smaller forms at her father's kitchen table when he was in disputes with neighboring farms. The moment when the legal shape of a situation resolved itself in the mind of the person who had the authority to name it, and everything that came after was just execution. "Mr. Voss," Crane said, "the transfer instrument your clerk certified was filed against a debt that was, at the time of certification, already an active settlement negotiation. Whether or not the certification date predates the signed settlement, the negotiation process creates a legal encumbrance that should have paused any transfer filing." He paused. "You want to explain to me why your clerk didn't know that or didn't care?" The silence from Voss was the loudest thing in the room. "The debt transfer is procedurally compromised," Crane said. "I'm not ruling it void today. That requires a full commission review, but I'm ruling it unenforceable for immediate purposes. The marriage contract stands as the operative settlement instrument pending that review." Something went through the room. Not visible. Atmospheric. The way pressure changes before weather. Voss stood. "Magistrate," he said, and his voice had dropped whatever remained of the pleasant register. "I want to be clear about what you're doing. I want you to understand the scope of what you're protecting and who you're protecting it for." He looked at Corvin. "This isn't over." "Sit down, Mr. Voss," Crane said. "I'm done sitting." He looked at Alara. The look was not physically threatening. It was worse than physically threatening. It was the look of a man filing something for later, the look of a man who operated on timelines, and who had just had his timeline disrupted but not destroyed. "You've been here one day," he said to her. "Yes," she said. "Impressive." And it wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, cold and direct, the kind of thing a man says when he's genuinely recalibrating what category someone belongs in. He left the hall. His two men followed. Crane gathered his documents and looked at Corvin with the expression of a man who had more to say and was choosing the economy of saying less of it. "I'll need a full deposition from both of you within the week. The certification irregularity needs to go on record before the commission review." He paused at the door. "Duke Hale, the clerk whose name is in that document. You'll want legal counsel before the review. I'd suggest someone from Carthen with commission fraud experience." "Yes," Corvin said. Crane left. The hall was quiet. Den and Marsh stayed by the door, professionally present and professionally absent at the same time. The fire crackled. Outside, she heard horses moving, Voss's men pulling out of the yard. Finally, the sound of it carrying all the weight of a temporary withdrawal rather than an ending. She looked at the table. Corvin looked at her. "How did you know the certification date would be wrong?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I looked because I was there when the magistrate came to my farm, and I knew what he said to me. And what he said to me didn't sound like a man presenting options in a contested situation. It sounded like a man presenting a script." She paused. When something sounds scripted, there's usually a script. Corvin was quiet for a long moment. The fire. The sound of the yard settling back into its ordinary functions outside. "He's going to try again," she said. "Yes. Not legally, not right away." She looked at the door Voss had gone through. "He said you've been surviving out here for 6 years. He said this isn't over." She turned back to Corvin. "He means it. I know what he means. The commission review takes how long? Weeks, possibly months if he contests the procedure. And in the meantime, he still has the prepared testimony, the survey, whatever else Aldrin didn't tell us about." She looked at her hands on the table, at the file she'd carried down the stairs and placed in front of Crane. "We won this morning. We didn't win." Corvin stood. He walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, the way she'd first seen him. The weight of a decision visible in the set of his shoulders before the decision itself was. "Aldrin's testimony will help," he said, "if he cooperates fully." "He will," she said. "He has nothing left to protect with Voss. Voss moves on from compromised assets." "I know." A pause. "The tenant farmers Voss got to, the ones with prepared testimony, they can be talked to." "Talked to how?" Honestly, his voice was flat. "They're frontier farmers. They signed what Voss put in front of them because they thought they had no options. Show them they have options, and most of them will choose differently." She looked at him. "You want me to go?" she said. Not quite a question. "I want to know if you're willing to," he said. "It would have to be you." A duke coming to revoke signed testimony reads as intimidation. A woman who was almost seized this morning reads as something different. The ask was real. She sat with the full weight of it, the practicality of what he was describing, the risk of it, and underneath both of those things the fact that he was asking rather than directing. Presenting it as a choice she had the actual power to make or decline. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, if you'll do it." "I'll do it." He looked at her across the main hall of Hale Fortress in the afternoon light, and whatever was on his face was not performance and not strategy. It was something older and more specific than either of those things. The expression of a man who had spent a long time operating in a world where every variable had a hidden cost, encountering a variable that so far appeared to cost something he was capable of paying. She didn't name it. It was too new, and the day was too full, and there was still too much to do for naming. "The East storeroom," she said. He nodded. "Aldrin." They both moved toward the door at the same time. The deposition took 2 hours. Aldrin talked. Not voluntarily. It required the cold, sustained pressure of Corvin at his most stripped back, the version of him she'd glimpsed when the name had first been said and his face had gone to its real structure underneath. But Aldrin talked, and what came out was more than what he'd given them in the kitchen. There was a second clerk. Not the one in the certification document, another one, further up in the commission hierarchy, who had been receiving quarterly payments routed through a land management company she'd need 3 days and the full supply requisition archive to trace properly. There were 6 tenant farmers with prepared testimony, not 2. The survey Aldrin had mentioned had been amended. A surveyor Voss employed had walked the eastern boundary markers and filed a revised measurement that shaved 40 feet off the Hale title's eastern edge, enough to make the access road legally ambiguous under territorial compact definitions. 40 feet. 4 years of patience and manipulation and careful theft and corruption purchased one commission official at a time, all of it aimed at 40 feet of frontier access road. By the time they came out of the storeroom, the light had changed. Mid-afternoon, the sun behind cloud cover, the fortress yard in the flat gray of a frontier autumn afternoon that had run out of mercy for the day. Petra was in the corridor with a tray. She looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had understood the shape of the day from its sounds and had made a decision to be useful in the ways available to her. The tray had food and water on it. Alara took it from her with a gratitude that surprised her with its depth. They ate in the main hall, not formally, Corvin at one end of the long table with the deposition notes spread out, Alara at the other end with Aldrin's full accounting laid beside the supply requisition files she'd had Petra retrieve from the study. Marsh stayed on the door. Den had gone to the east gate. They worked. It was strange, the working. Strange in the sense that it felt natural, which was not what she'd expected from any version of this day. The rhythm of 2 people who thought similarly moving through a shared problem, the occasional exchange of information across the length of the table, the competence of it. She had not worked alongside anyone in 2 years. Her father's collapse had made her solitary by necessity, and she had adapted to the solitude the way you adapted to things that were hard, by making it functional, stripping out the parts that required something she no longer had. This was not solitude. She filed it without examining it too closely. The day was not done. At one point, Corvin said, across the table, "The surveyor's amended filing. That's the core of the access road argument. If we can get the original survey documents and demonstrate the amendment was filed without independent verification, the original survey would be in the county records archive," she said, "in Carthen. I have a contact there. How long to get it? 3 days, if I send tonight." "Send tonight," she said. He wrote the message himself. She watched him do it from across the table, the same hand she'd seen on the contract in her study, direct and unornamented. The afternoon became evening. She was on the 3rd supply requisition file when she found it. Not an irregularity, something stranger than that. A delivery receipt for goods that had been signed for and logged, but that didn't appear in any inventory record she'd been through. The goods were routine, timber supplies, hardware, nothing remarkable in isolation. The delivery address was a secondary outbuilding at the fortress's north edge, one she hadn't visited. The date was 2 weeks ago, before she arrived. Before any of today's events had been visible on the surface of things. Before, as far as she'd understood the sequence, Voss had any reason to be moving physical assets into the territory. She stood up. Corvin looked up from his notes. "There's a secondary outbuilding at the north edge of the property," she said. "What's in it?" He was still for a moment. "Storage. It's been empty for years." "A delivery was made there 2 weeks ago," she said. "Signed by Aldrin. Not entered in any inventory." Corvin stood. The way he stood, the specific quality of the motion, the shift from working stillness to something more loaded, told her he was running the same calculation she was running, and the calculation was arriving at the same answer. 12 men at the east gate, a magistrate already on his way before Voss finished his morning visit, 4 years of patient preparation, a delivery to an empty outbuilding 2 weeks ago that hadn't been logged. "Get Marsh," Corvin said. His voice was very quiet. She was already moving toward the door when the sound came from outside. Not hoofbeats this time, not the approach of something, but the sound of something already present, the sound of a man shouting from the direction of the east gate, and underneath it, barely audible through the stone and the distance, the specific hard crack of wood under forced impact. They were not at the East Road junction anymore. They were already inside the outer wall. Corvin was through the main hall door before the echo of the impact finished, and she was 3 steps behind him, and Marsh was ahead of both of them by the time they reached the yard, and the yard was full of torchlight that was not the fortress's torchlight. It was moving torchlight, carried torchlight, the kind of light that travels with men who are in a hurry and not trying to be quiet about it anymore. Corvin stopped in the center of the yard. 8 men. Not 12. 8. The others presumably covering the outer wall and the gate approach. They had torches, and they had weapons, and they had the specific organized deployment of men who'd been briefed on the layout of the space they were entering. Not a raid, a seizure. The controlled, purposeful advance of illegal action being enforced by men who'd been told they had the authority. At the edge of the torchlight, behind the line of Voss's men, stood a figure she recognized from the morning's adjusted commission files. The second clerk, the one higher in the hierarchy. He was holding a document, and behind him, at the gate, she could see two more figures arriving on foot, a man she didn't recognize, and beside him, moving into the torchlight with the unhurried walk of someone who had planned this moment for months, Garrett Voss. He looked at Corvin across the yard. The amended survey was filed with the Territorial Commission 3 weeks ago, Voss said. His voice was pleasant again. The review I requested this morning was denied, but a second magistrate, one with Eastern District Authority, has ruled the access road a matter of contested public title. He paused. Which means Hale Fortress is currently on contested ground. Which means the Commission has the right to secure the premises pending resolution. Corvin said nothing. The marriage contract, Voss continued, settles a debt that is itself under review. The Commission has issued a temporary suspension of all contracts contingent on that debt until the review is complete. He paused one more time. Which means your wife, Corvin, is technically here without a valid legal instrument. And I have a document signed by an Eastern District Magistrate that says she comes with me while the review proceeds. The yard was very still. 8 men with torches, the clerk with his document, Voss in the torchlight with his pleasant face and his months of preparation and his absolute certainty that he had covered every angle. Alara felt Corvin go still beside her with the quality she'd felt on the wall and in the kitchen and across the table all day. The stillness that was not the absence of motion but its opposite. The stillness of something deciding. She looked at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were on Voss and they were the darkest gray she'd seen them. Not exhaustion now, something else entirely. And she understood, in the way she'd been understanding things all day. The way her father had trained her to understand things by looking at the full shape before the individual parts. That what happened in the next 10 seconds was going to be the actual point of no return. The moment that couldn't be walked back through commission reviews or survey documents or depositions. The legal angles were exhausted. The paperwork was done. What was left was a man who had built an empire through fear, deciding whether to spend the last of what he had on something the law could not protect and the law could not provide. She's not going anywhere, Corvin said, and his hand found hers in the dark between them. His hand was warm. She hadn't expected that. In the cold of the yard, with the torchlight moving and 8 men deployed in the careful geometry of a planned operation, the warmth of his hand around hers was the most specific thing she'd felt all day. More specific than fear, more specific than the legal precision of what she'd found in the commission file, more specific than the relief when Crane's voice had gone cold in the main hall. Just that. Warmth. A man's hand around hers in the dark, saying the only thing that mattered without a word of it spoken. Voss looked at their joined hands. Something crossed his face, not surprise, not quite, but the expression of a man encountering a variable that his model hadn't weighted correctly, that he'd categorized as sentiment and was now reclassifying as something with structural implications. This is not how frontier law works, Corvin, Voss said. Whatever you feel about the situation, I told you what was happening, Corvin said. She's not going anywhere. The Eastern District Magistrate's order is based on a survey amendment filed by your employee, Corvin said, against a debt transfer certified before the original settlement was legally complete, processed through a clerk who has been receiving payments from your accounts for 4 years, in a commission office where you have cultivated 2 officials whose authorization numbers appear in financial records I now have in my possession. He paused. That's not a legal order. That's a document. Voss was quiet. The difference matters, Corvin said, because a document can be challenged and a legal order can't. And everything you built this on can be challenged, all of it. Every piece of paper, every prepared testimony, every amended measurement. It can all be challenged because it was all built on a foundation that was rotten before the first stone went down. Another pause. You spent 4 years on this. You spent 4 years building something on Aldrin's information and compromised clerks and tenant farmers who needed a signature notarized more than they needed the truth. And it held until a woman arrived who'd spent 2 years reading her father's accounts while he burned his own land down around her. The yard was completely still. Voss looked at her. One day, he said. One day, she said. You should have moved faster. What happened in Voss's face then was not rage. It was the collapse of a particular kind of confidence, the kind that had been built over time and had started to mistake itself for inevitability. She watched it happen with the same precision she'd applied to everything else, and she understood that this was the actual moment, not the magistrate's ruling and not the commission review that would come after, but this. The moment a man who had operated on the assumption that he was dealing with variables that could be managed encountered something that couldn't be managed and knew it. He looked at his men. "Stand down," he said. The two men flanking him held their positions for a half-second, the half-second of men checking whether an instruction was final or tactical. And then they moved back. The torches held. The organized deployment held its shape but lost its forward pressure. And that loss was everything because forward pressure had been the whole of it. The clerk with the document put it inside his coat. "The commission review will proceed," Voss said. His voice was even, professionally even. The evenness of a man who operated on long timelines and had not yet run out of them, but even she could hear the thing underneath it now. The thin quality of a structure that had lost a load-bearing element. "This isn't finished." "No," Corvin said, "but tonight it is." Voss held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the gate, and his men moved with him, and the torches moved with them, and the yard began slowly to resolve back into its ordinary dark. Alara watched until the last torch passed through the gate. Then she became aware that she was still holding Corvin's hand. She didn't let go. Neither did he. The night was long and the work continued. Marsh sent the messenger to Carthen before the hour was out. The contact Corvin had mentioned, the one who could retrieve the original survey from the county archive. Den took 4 men to verify the outer gate was secured and the north outbuilding locked. She sat in the study with the supply requisition files until close to midnight, building the full paper trail of the secondary clerk's payments into a document that could be submitted with a commission fraud complaint. And when her eyes stopped tracking the columns accurately, she set the pen down and admitted the day had reached its functional limit. Corvin was in the hall when she came down, not working, just there, standing at the window that looked out on the yard with a cup in his hand, not drinking from it. He heard her on the stairs and turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the quiet between them was different from the quiet of the morning, which had been the quiet of 2 people assessing each other across an unknown distance. This was something that had been reduced by the day's events to something smaller and more honest. "You should sleep," he said. "I know." She came down the last 3 steps and stood in the hall. "You should too." Later. She understood that. There was a version of tonight for him that required processing he couldn't do in front of her. The version that had Aldrin in it, and 6 years, and whatever the interior arithmetic of that betrayal looked like at midnight when the action had stopped and the stillness allowed it to surface. She didn't move toward the stairs. "My father," she said. Not sure exactly where she was going with it, she let it find its own direction. "After my mother died, he changed. Not all at once. It was slow. The kind of slow you almost don't notice until you notice all at once." She looked at the window. He started making decisions from fear. Not his own fear specifically. The fear of what people would think, what the neighbors would say, what the commission would do if the farm fell below the tax threshold. He made every decision from that position for 2 years, and every decision made everything worse. She paused. "That's what I was managing, not the farm. The consequences of decisions made from fear." Corvin listened. "You didn't do that today," she said. "Any of it. You had 12 men at your gate and a legal instrument designed to take everything you'd built, and you didn't make a single decision from fear." He was quiet for a moment. "I had reasons not to." "You had me," she said. "I know. I'm not discounting that." She looked at him. "I'm saying I noticed. I'm saying it matters. What a person uses as their foundation when the ground goes out. And yours held." Something moved in his face that she'd seen once before. In the kitchen, when Aldrin had made his calculation visible. When Corvin's face had briefly dropped everything that wasn't the unmediated truth of what he was feeling. Just for a moment. Just the real thing. "Alara," he said. "I know," she said. "I know it's too early, and the day was too much, and neither of us is in a position to—" "I was going to say thank you," he said. "That's all." She stopped. He looked at her with the gray eyes that were not the exhausted gray now, and not the dark gray of the confrontation in the yard, some middle register she hadn't cataloged yet because she hadn't seen it before. Something rested. Thank you, he said, for the file, for the wall, for not leaving when you had every reason to. She stood with that for a moment. Let it be what it was. I had good reasons to stay, she said. The contract has a year in it, and I intend to use the time. She paused. And the accounts need work. Beyond the irregularities, your grain commission structure is inefficient, and I have ideas about the eastern supply route that have nothing to do with Voss. The sound he made was not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it, the sound of a man who had not expected to end this particular day in this register, the brief, involuntary release of something that had been held tightly for a very long time. Good night, Duke Hale, she said. Good night, Elara. She went upstairs. She slept. The commission review took 11 weeks. She knew it would be long. She had not known it would be what it was. Not a clean legal process, but a rolling, grinding confrontation with every layer of what Voss had built, the kind of institutional combat that required patience she had to develop in real time, because the patience she'd arrived with had been the patience of a person surviving, and what this required was the patience of a person building. Different muscles. She had to learn them. The original survey arrived from Carthan on the 4th day. The discrepancy with Voss's amended version was not 40 feet, it was 63, and the original bore 3 independent witness signatures from the initial Territorial Boundary Commission, which predated every legal framework Voss had invoked. The amended survey collapsed as a legal document inside a week. The tenant farmers were harder. She rode out with Corvin the second morning as he'd asked. They went to 4 farms in 2 days, and the conversations were not easy. They were frontier people, careful with trust in the specific way of people who had learned that trust was a resource that depleted and didn't always refill. She didn't make promises. She showed them the original documents. She explained what the amended testimony would have required them to swear to and how it compared to what was actually in the territorial record. She let them read it themselves, and watching them read, watching the moment when understanding arrived in a person's face and reconfigured what they thought their options were, she recognized something her father had given her that she hadn't fully valued until now. He taught her that literacy was the one thing that couldn't be confiscated. She was teaching it forward. 3 of the 4 farmers formally withdrew their prepared testimony within the week. Aldrin's deposition was submitted to the commission in full. He cooperated completely, and she thought about the look on his face in the kitchen, the moment she'd called it a choice, and understood that what had happened there was not redemption, which was too clean a word for something so complicated, but accountability, which was harder and more durable. He had made choices, and the choices had consequences, and he had finally chosen to face them directly. That was not nothing. It didn't undo the harm, but it was not nothing. The commission ruled in the 8th week. The debt transfer was voided. The amended survey was expunged from the territorial record. 2 commission clerks faced fraud proceedings. The Eastern Access Road was confirmed as Hale title. Voss did not contest the final ruling. She'd expected him to. She'd spent the 11th week braced for a final legal maneuver, a challenge filed in the Capital Commission rather than the Territorial Office, something on the outer edge of his remaining resources. It didn't come. She watched the deadline pass and sat with the absence of it, and understood that what she was seeing was the end of a particular kind of man's operating model. Not his destruction, not his erasure, but the collapse of the specific method that had sustained him. He would adapt. Men like Voss always adapted, but he would not be able to do it here, on this ground, against this particular combination of people, and that was enough. It was enough. Kirk. The frontier winter came in hard and early that year. She learned the fortress's rhythms in the cold months. The way the stone held temperatures differently in different wings, the west rooms warming faster from the kitchen building's heat, the north tower staying cold until February regardless of what you burned. She learned which of the staff had been there long enough to know where Aldrin had hidden things. Not physical things, but administrative things, the small organizational decisions that a steward made over years that embedded his habits into the household's functioning and had to be found and changed one by one. She reorganized the grain commission contracts in October, restructured the supply route agreements in November, the way she'd mentioned to Corvin that first night, and the change produced an efficiency improvement in the estate accounts that Corvin looked at for a long time before he said anything. "You were right about the eastern route," he said. "I know," she said. "The numbers were obvious." "They weren't obvious to me. You weren't looking at them like someone who'd spent 2 years finding ways to make a failing operation not fail." She paused. Different training. He looked at the accounts for a moment longer. Then he looked at her. What else? He said. What else have you seen that I'm missing? The question was real. That was the thing about Corvin, the thing she'd been cataloging since the first morning, and that the catalog had confirmed over and over. When he asked a question, he wanted the actual answer, and he had the rarer capacity of a person who could take an answer that complicated his existing picture and integrate it rather than dismiss it. She had met very few people in her life who could do that cleanly. Her father had not been one of them. She told him what she'd seen. It took 2 hours. He listened to all of it. Somewhere in the winter, without either of them marking the specific moment, the dynamic shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing about the way they moved through their life together was dramatic after the first day. The drama had burned off in the yard with Voss's torches and left behind something quieter and more durable. It was in small things. The way he'd started leaving the estate accounts on her desk rather than Aldrin's replacement's desk, defaulting to her as the first reader. The way she'd started sitting in on the land commission meetings, not because anyone had assigned it, but because her presence had become functionally assumed. The way they'd begun, in the evenings, to work in the same room without the formality of deciding to do so. She noticed the shift the way she noticed most things, not in the moment, but shortly after, when the pattern had become clear enough to name. She named it to herself in December, alone in the study with the winter light coming through the window that looked out over the tree line. She let it sit there in her internal accounting without the weight of what it was supposed to mean, without the inherited framework of what a woman feeling this was supposed to do with it. Just the fact of it, clear and unornamented. She was not here because she had to be. She had not been here because she had to be for some time. The year clause in the contract for Yiying, the one she'd read 4 times in the first hour, the one she'd anchored herself to in the early days as the proof that she retained a self that could not be absorbed into someone else's estate, had become something she thought about differently now. Not a door, just a clause. A thing in a document that mapped a reality she no longer needed the document to confirm. She was free. She had been free since the first morning when the keys arrived before the hour was out. The freedom had been real all along, and what had changed was not the fact of it, but her understanding of what she wanted to use it for. She wanted to use it for this. He found her at the east wall one morning in late December. Not the walkway where they'd stood against Voss, the lower section, where the stone was oldest, where the original builders had laid the foundation before the fortress became what it was. She'd taken to walking there in the early morning, when the air was cold enough to be clarifying. He came along the base of the wall and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they were just 2 people standing in a winter morning in the old part of a fortress that had become, without either of them planning it precisely, a home. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "About." She looked out at the tree line, bare now, the skeletal winter version of the boundary she'd observed from her study window on the first morning when she'd been trying to understand the ground she was standing on. "About how different this looks than what I imagined on the road here," she said. 11 months ago. He came to stand beside her. He did that easily now, moved into her proximity without the careful distance of the early days, and she had long since stopped finding it remarkable because it had become ordinary, in the best sense of that word. "What did you imagine?" he said. "Something colder," she said. "Something that required more surviving and less living." She paused. "I was good at surviving. I wasn't sure I remembered how to do the other thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I built this place to survive in," he said. "That was the whole design. Walls high enough, access roads controlled, information managed. Nobody inside who wasn't useful." A pause. "I was very precise about it." "You were," she said. "And then you put a study in the West Wing for someone you'd never met." He looked at the tree line. She could see the working of something in his profile. Not the controlled recalibration of the early days, but something that had more space in it, the expression of a man who had learned over the course of a year to let the distance between what he felt and what he showed become a little shorter. "I read your father's accounts," he said, "and I thought, whoever is doing this, whoever has been keeping this running while everything around them is collapsing, is the kind of person who should have a room with a window and a desk and a lock on the door." Another pause. "I thought it before I knew anything else about you, just from the numbers." She looked at him. "That's possibly the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I figured you'd recognize it," he said. "Given your background in ledgers." The almost laugh, the same sound she'd heard from him that first night, the brief involuntary thing. It was more frequent now. She'd stopped cataloging it because it had become part of the ordinary texture of days, and she understood that this was what it looked like when a person was, slowly and imperfectly, learning to live alongside trust rather than manage its absence. She turned to face him. "The year is almost up," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes." "The clause is real," she said. "You told me that the first night." "It's real," he said. His voice was steady, and there was nothing in it that tried to move the weight of the moment in any direction. He was just present in it, fully, the way he was present in everything that mattered. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at the commission files and the payroll records and the survey documents, looking for the real shape underneath the presented surface, looking for what was actually there rather than what she was expected to see. What she saw was a man who had built his entire world around not needing anyone and had handed her the keys on the first day. "I'm not leaving," she said. He breathed. It was not a dramatic breath. It was the quiet kind, the kind that releases something that has been held a long time, carefully, at a cost that only becomes visible when the holding finally ends. "Okay," he said. Just that. One word, the way he used one word, when 10 would have been less honest. The winter light was coming over the tree line. The smithy had started up somewhere in the yard below, the ordinary morning percussion of a working fortress. She could hear Den crossing the yard from the stable block, and somewhere in the kitchen building the cook's morning routine, the sounds of a household in motion, a household that had become, without her fully tracking the moment it crossed the threshold, her household. She turned back to the tree line. They stood together in the cold morning at the base of the oldest wall, and the silence between them was not the silence of two people assessing each other across an unknown distance. It was the other kind. The kind that only exists between people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side into something they didn't have a name for before they found it. After a while, she said, "The spring commission schedule needs restructuring. The way the inspection dates overlap with the planting cycle costs every tenant farmer in the Eastern District 2 productive days a year." "I know," he said. "I've known for years." "Then why?" "Because I didn't have anyone to restructure it with," he said. "And some problems wait for the right person." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line. She let herself feel the full weight of the year. Every ledger and every commission file and every cold morning on the wall and every conversation across the long table, the accumulated weight of it, and underneath all of it, the things she'd been building without a name for it. The thing that turned out to be not survival and not strategy, but something she'd almost forgotten existed. A life. She put her hand in his. The frontier winter held around them, cold and clear, and entirely indifferent to what two people chose in the space it provided. The way the world is always indifferent to small human decisions, while those decisions quietly become the only things that ever actually matter. They went inside together.